Welcome to Beyond the Headlines, the podcast that brings a voice to the voiceless. My name is Asha Kaltal.
And I'm Louisa Vieira. Today we're diving into a series of agreements that have been central to the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, also known as the Minsk agreements. These agreements were supposed to help end the fighting in eastern Ukraine, but as we all know, peace has remained elusive. So what happened, and what's the true legacy of Minsk?
Well, that's what we're going to unpack today. The Minsk agreements, signed in 2014 and 2015, were seen as a major diplomatic effort to resolve the conflict in eastern Ukraine that erupted after Russia's annexation of Crimea. Background?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the conflict in eastern Ukraine began back in 2014 after Russia annexed Crimea and political unrest shook Ukraine. That unrest led to the ousting of pro-Russian and minor pronunciations President Viktor Yanukovych, which was a huge turning point. This political chaos sparked protests in the eastern regions, with Russia stepping in and being accused of backing, quote, separatist movements. Eventually, separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk declared independence, calling themselves the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic.
Yeah, perfect. As fighting broke out between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists, the situation spiraled fast. Thousands of people lost their lives, and the region was plunged into a full-blown war. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, and the violence displaced millions, creating a massive humanitarian crisis. Both sides pointed fingers, blaming each other for escalating the conflict, while the international community scrambled to find a way to stop the bloodshed.
And that's where the Minsk agreements came in. The first round, known as Minsk I, was signed in September 2014, followed by Minsk II in February 2015. Both were brokered by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the OSCE, and involved Ukraine, Russia, and the separatists. But let's be real, most of the world saw Russia as the real force behind the conflict, even if it wasn't officially acknowledged in the negotiations. These agreements were seen as the way to calm things down, at least temporarily.
So what exactly did the Minsk agreements aim to achieve? Well, the main goal was to create a sort of ceasefire and establish a roadmap for peace. The Minsk I agreement included provisions for an immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of heavy weapons, and the release of prisoners. It also called for humanitarian aid to reach the region and for international monitors to oversee things. But as we all know, it didn't hold. Violations started almost immediately after it was signed.
Yeah, Minsk I fell apart pretty quickly, as Asha said, and that's when Minsk II came into play, and this time it had a more detailed measures. Minsk II included 13 points. Some of the key ones were a full ceasefire, the withdrawal of heavy artillery, constitutional reforms in Ukraine to give more autonomy to the separatist regions, and Ukraine regaining control of its border with Russia. This version tried to fill some of the gaps in the Minsk I by adding clearer steps and timelines, but it still didn't come with a strong way to enforce it.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Minsk II didn't tackle the bigger issues at the heart of the conflict. Sure, it talked about a ceasefire and political reforms, but it didn't touch on the future of Crimea, which Russia had already annexed, or what would happen to the separatist regions in the long term. That left a lot of gray areas for both sides to argue over.
Yeah, exactly. And that was one of the biggest sticking points, which was the local elections in the separatist regions. Minsk II said they had to happen under Ukrainian law, but that never happened. Ukraine didn't want to give autonomy to regions they saw as being controlled by Russia, while Russia kept pushing for these elections to happen, but on their terms, not Ukraine's. It was a classic standoff with both sides pointing fingers and no real trust to make it work. And in the end, without the real buy-in or someone to hold both sides accountable, the agreement kind of just unraveled.
So, if the Minsk agreements had such lofty goals, why didn't they work?
There are a few key reasons, and one of the biggest is that both sides had very different interpretations of the agreement.
Exactly. And Russia pushed for a more decentralized Ukraine, where the Donetsk and Luhansk regions would have more autonomy, basically giving them greater control over their affairs. Ukraine, however, saw this as a concession to Russian influence and feared it could lead to further disintegration of their country.
And then there's the issue of enforcement. Neither side fully committed to implementing the ceasefire or withdrawing troops and weapons. The OSCE, while playing a monitoring role, didn't have the mandate or the resources to enforce compliance on the ground.
And I guess essentially both sides were able to keep fighting while claiming to be following the agreement.
Exactly, and let's not forget the political dynamics. Internally, in both Ukraine and Russia, there were powerful political forces who didn't want peace. In Ukraine, many saw the agreement as a form of quote-unquote surrender to Russia, and in Russia, the leadership saw it as a way to maintain leverage over Ukraine without fully taking responsibility for the separatists.
Yeah, so looking at the legacy of the Minsk agreements, what do we have? Well, despite both Minsk I and Minsk II being hailed as a diplomatic breakthrough at the time, they ultimately failed to resolve the conflict.
The fighting in eastern Ukraine continued. Although there were periods of reduced intensity, the status quo was still not sustainable.
No, and when we look at the broader context of the Russian-Ukrainian relations, the Minsk agreements almost felt like I don't know, like a footnote in the larger story. The agreements were supposed to pave the way for a peaceful solution, but instead, they served as a temporary pause in a much larger unresolved conflict.
In hindsight, Minsk was less about peace building and more about managing optics on the international stage, as both sides used it to justify their respective stances.
And with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it's clear that the Minsk process ultimately did not prevent the escalation of the war.
Yeah, exactly. And what's striking is how Russia weaponized diplomacy through these agreements. Russia used Minsk process as a way to buy time and continue its strategy of destabilizing Ukraine while avoiding full responsibility for the war.
Yeah, and the agreements, instead of being a path to peace, became a tool for diplomatic maneuvering. And Ukraine, for its part, has been highly critical of the Minsk agreements, seeing them as a diplomatic failure that didn't hold Russia accountable.
The Ukrainian government, especially after 2014, has felt increasingly distrustful of any deal that involves Russia.